So first of all, welcome everyone. Good morning for those of you that are joining us in the North American context. Good afternoon and evening for those of you joining us from further afield. This is our final panel discussion, session 3 of this year's Brave Conversations in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning series. This is a collaboration between Mount Royal University's Mukakik Center for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning with our colleagues up the road in Calgary at the University of Calgary's Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning. Our aim with this series, and if you've had the opportunity to join us previously, is that we want to bring together a diverse community of scholars and practitioners to engage with ideas that are at the edges of our practice, perhaps to discuss topics that might feel important, but perhaps still peripheral to the things that we get to talk about in conference spaces or with our colleagues in our corridors as we're engaging with scholarship of teaching and learning. And this season, we're particularly interested in the 3 sessions that we've been delivering to look at how risk is taken up, how it's understood, experienced, and sustained within our solo practice. Our final session today returns to some of the ideas and questions that colleagues discussed in sessions 1 and 2. So it's a revisiting, but also building on those ideas and reframing, offering a reframing of some of the ways that we think about risk in scholarship of teaching and learning. My name is Cherie Woolmer. I'm Assistant Professor and Canada Research Chair in Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, based here in the Academic Development Centre and the Mukakik Centre for SoTL at Mount Royal University. And I'm really delighted to be bringing friends and colleagues together today in this panel, along with support from my colleagues at the Taylor Institute at the University of Calgary. To begin in a good way and in commitment to truth and reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we're gathering in conversation. While many of you are joining us from different places, I'm speaking to you from Mukintis in Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. This land is home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the I'ithka Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. It's with deep gratitude and reciprocity that I acknowledge this land as a place of learning and commit to ongoing relationships grounded in respect and responsibility. So before we jump into the exciting part of this session, I just want to signal that this time together, how we'll be running the session. My panelists were very keen for this not to be a session where you listen to their wise words for an hour and then ask questions at the end. So in essence of co-creating this together, what we've done is sectioned this into 3 parts. So there'll be opportunity for about 20 minutes of conversation and hearing from our panelists, and then a chance for us to bring in questions from the audience. So I'd really encourage you to add to the chat as we're going. And my colleague Christina will be monitoring the chat for us, and I'll be able to bring in conversation and questions as we go. In the previous sessions this season, we've explored the ideas of risk in SoTL through the lenses of care and failure. And as I said, we'll be revisiting these ideas, but connecting them to the history and the current focus of the SoTL movement. We'll be discussing how risk intersects with those ideas of failure, vulnerability, or uncertainty, but asking important questions such as, are some colleagues or students at greater risk than others? Who is afforded safety, protection, and grace? And who is not? And what can we learn when we take an intersectional or a post-colonial lens to understand risk for people who engage in SoTL? I'm delighted now to formally introduce our panelists. Today we have Jay Overholser, PhD candidate, who will be finishing in the next year, based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary. For those of you that joined us at earlier sessions, Jay was a member of our first panel talking about the ethic of care in scholarship of teaching and learning. Next, we have my colleague, Dr. Noreen Mumtaz, Assistant Professor in the Department of Information Design and Communication Studies at Mount Royal University. And finally, Dr. Peter Felton, with the longest job title in the field, Executive Director of the Center for Engaged Learning, Professor of History, and Assistant Provost at Elon University, based in the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my slides here so that we can see our panelists well. And I would like to get us started with our first section of questions and to invite our panelists to reflect on how we can connect the discussions about risk with the historical and present day priorities of scholarship of teaching and learning. And Peter, perhaps I can begin with you. Could you share with us your perspective on how the concept of risk has shown up historically in scholarship of teaching and learning, perhaps drawing on Boyer's kind of earliest framings of the field, through to kind of some of Bass's work and your own work around dealing with the wicked problems that we're facing now in post-secondary education?
Sure. Shuri, thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's an honor to be here and to be part of this wonderful panel. And I want to special thanks to Shuri and the team who organized all of this, because it takes a lot of work to make something look smooth and easy. And my title, I have a mentor who said many years ago that the longer your title in higher education, the less important you are. Like really meaningful titles like student and professor, full stop. So take long titles as you will. But I'm going to take this invitation. I'm a historian by training. So it fits my inclination, my disciplinary training, to look back at where scholarship, teaching, and learning came from. And I want to put something in the chat, not that you need to chase it down right now, but just to honor that a colleague, Johan Hertesma, who is at the National University in Singapore, Johan and I had maybe 5 years of conversations about these issues and ended up in an article that I'm going to draw on right now. But what we did is we went back to reread the founding texts in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And so you don't have to do them. That sort of the foundational text, the place where the term scholarship of teaching comes from is Ernest Boyer's 1990 book, Scholarship Reconsidered, which often now people think about as saying we need to have different scholarships. That really wasn't entirely Boyer's point. Boyer's main point, and he was looking at higher education in the United States, is that after World War II, up until 1990, what it meant to be a scholar in the United States had become increasingly narrow and increasingly focused in ways that he did not think were good for faculty, for institutions, or for the world. In fact, when we reread his book, it's striking how that book could have been published just a few years ago. To give you some of his words, I mean, he writes about the social mandates of research and of higher education. He writes about human dignity. He writes about purpose, public good, justice, the environment, abortion, peace. All of these things are what he's writing about. So he was not calling for a sort of narrow version of a scholarship of teaching or a scholarship of teaching and learning that was about what a lot of my own research was, which was like, do students get marginally better at this one disciplinary skill? He was saying what we need is scholarships that live into the academic and social mandates of higher education. And so one of the questions Johan and I asked is like, well, how do we get to where we are right now from this really broad and justice-based foundation? And in the article, we say, we don't think there was some nefarious whatever. We think I think, there was sort of natural, well, not natural, ordinary professionalization that happened, where we got where we got journals and we got conferences and we got what is good, good practice and things like that. And I might have even contributed to that in some ways. But what that led to is people quite reasonably doing small, manageable projects, small, manageable inquiries into things in their classroom. And I don't think it's all of us walking away from the idea that we care about justice. It's just I can't inquire into justice in my classroom. I can inquire into, can students read texts more effectively as historians? So that's what I will do. And then there's of course pressures from neoliberal universities to publish, to look like other disciplines, to things like this, right? And so that's gotten us to a place where there was an article published by Randy Bass, I could put a link in the chat to it, about 5 years ago. And Randy had written a really foundational SoTL article in the late 90s called What's the Problem? And the way too short version of that article says simply, we don't know how to talk about our teaching with each other. And his point is, if you ask a colleague about their research, they're supposed to have problems in their research. And the problems are interesting. And if you ask a colleague about teaching, you're not supposed to have problems in your teaching. Right? Teaching you're supposed to be good at. And so he was calling for sort of problematizing teaching. And so in 2020 or so, he wrote a new version, What's the Problem Now? And he ends up with 3 points that I think are really helpful for us thinking about what the problem is now for SoTL. And it's we don't understand learning and student learning enough. We don't know how to scale equitably the things that work. And we don't know enough about how to make our own work and our institutions better contribute to justice and sustainability in the world. Right? And so the problems are those things. And I think how this all ties to risk is, I think the original version of Boyer was actually asking for a lot of risk out of folks doing SoTL. And I think what we have done is developed an approach to SoTL that is safer, that is more conventionally academic, and that doesn't fully live into the social mandates of our work and the needs of our world. And I think that's created some problems for SoTL too. That's probably more than I should have said.
Thank you, Peter. And I think bringing us back to those early intentions and just being able to think about the way that the field has grown, how it's evolved, and how there seems to be a return to thinking about some of those fundamental issues, perhaps not necessarily through the lens of risk, but certainly a return to thinking about some of those earlier foundations. And Noreen, perhaps if I could bring you in here and just ask from your perspective and building on Peter's kind of historical take there about the development of the field, I'm wondering what your perception is around what you think scholarship of teaching and learning is actually for, and where you see risk and risk taking fitting in with your own kind of ideas about what scholarship of teaching and learning is.
I'm just checking if I'm unmuted because I usually keep saying stuff while I'm muted. Yeah, thank you, Sherry. And I really appreciate Peter's historical framing here, which shifts the lens from methods inquiry to social justice and other contemporary milieu in which we exist is a part of SoTL inquiry, and it can't be separated from that, in my opinion. I think this question that what is SoTL for is such an important one because it asks us to move beyond seeing SoTL only as a method or as an evidence of good teaching or as a professional development activity. Having said that, for me, SoTL is fundamentally about making teaching and learning available for inquiry, making it visual in some way so that people can engage with it. It gives us a way to pause inside the everyday work, our everyday work of teaching, and asking what is actually happening here, who's learning, who's being served well by the structures we have created through our curriculum, through our pedagogy, what assumptions are shaping our classrooms, our curricula, our definitions of success, how do we define success in our courses. So I see SoTL as having both a reflective and a change-making purpose woven into it. So it helps us understand teaching and learning more deeply, but it should also help us imagine how things could be otherwise. How could we imagine futures? How could we speculate? And this is where risk becomes important. Because risk enters when SoTL does not simply confirm what we already know or ask questions that are already institutionally safe. It enters when we ask questions that may unsettle our own assumptions or reveal that our well-intentioned teaching practices are not working equally well for all students. For example, in my own context of design education, I think about group work and critique a lot. Um, a, a safer SoTL question might be, did group work improve student learning? Did students find critique useful? So those are valid questions, of course, but riskier questions might ask, whose ideas are taken up in group work? Whose labor becomes invisible? Um, who feels confident enough to speak in critique sessions? And when does critique support learning? And when does it reproduce hierarchies of taste, of confidence, of language, or cultural capital? So these questions, these are relational, they are effective, and sometimes they are also messy, and they are not always easy to be measured or published in conventional ways, but they may tell us much more about what students are actually experiencing or learning, and at the same time what are their facilitators of learning experiencing. And so at the same time, I think we have to be careful not to over romanticize risk, because risk is not evenly distributed, as Sherry talked about it in her intro. Some scholars can ask difficult questions and be recognized as innovative or courageous. Others may ask similar questions and be seen as too personal or too political or not rigorous enough. So for me, risk taking fits into SoTL when it helps us ask more honest questions about teaching and learning. And it's not just about safer or more manageable questions. But it also requires us to ask who's being asked to take the risk, who is protected when they do take the risk, and what kinds of knowledge become possible because of that risk. So I will just stop here. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just getting warmed up.
Wonderful. There's so much in there, Noreen. And I was saying to my panelists, the hardest thing about facilitating a conversation is when you want to kind of jump in and join. And I just want to kind of acknowledge that how helpful it was, Noreen, to hear you offer the different examples of the kinds of questions we might ask of a teaching problem, going back to Peter's framing there of Randy Bass's work. And the kinds of questions that we ask kind of shifts nicely into, perhaps Jay, I could bring you in here to build on some of the ideas that you shared in the first session, and take up this idea of not just the kinds of questions that get asked, but if you could perhaps expand for us on drawing on some of your own experiences around where you see some of the tensions between what are the important questions, building on Noreen's idea, like what are the questions that we really need to get at, and what might be safe questions, and where you see the tension in that for us as we're thinking about the kinds of SoTL work that we might do and the kinds of inquiry that we might engage in.
Yeah, so I am, as Sherry mentioned in my introduction, in sociology right now, but a lot of my background is in queer studies and gender studies. And so when I see something labeled as like important, I'm already thinking important in terms of who. So there's already like just tension within that term of what I think is important to ask is going to be different from what Noreen might think is important to ask, or what my department head might think is important to ask. So even just in determining what we think of as important brings in a lot of tension, especially when we start to think about some of those different positions that different people hold. Where for me, teaching in Alberta, questions around gender and how we talk about some of these really uncomfortable topics in the classroom are really important to me. But that is also not like necessarily safer questions to ask in this current climate. Whereas someone else, their important questions might be a little bit safer. And again, safe feels like a very loaded term. Because I could be asking certain questions about race that are easier for me or might be institutionally safer. I might experience less backlash from the institution about asking about that than someone who is more visually marginalized when it comes to race. And so I think, as we'll get into with some of the later questions, so much about that tension really comes with who's asking that question, the context that they're asking it in, all those kinds of things. But kind of like queerness. So when it comes to queerness, one of the things that I think is quite interesting is the further you get from positions of privilege, I think sometimes the more expansive the opportunities for existence feel. So like with transness, the further you get away from this gender binary, the more endless the possibilities of gender feels. Well, I think the same thing with the kind of questions we ask in SoTL of the less accepted within the institution you might feel. I think the more endless possibilities there are, it feels like, to ask about, because you feel less entrenched in that system that kind of constrains what we think to ask, what we think is valuable to ask, what we think is important to ask. And I know we'll talk later on about some other things, but there's kind of also that tension between both. You're in a more precarious position, but also those riskier quote unquote questions also feel less risky in some regards to ask, because you're like, well, this is what matters more to me. So I'll probably end it there because I'm starting to go into some of our other questions.
No, it's wonderful, and it's giving me pause to think about some of the conversations we have in the field about what counts. We talk about what counts as rigor, what counts as evidence, what counts as kind of a convincing argument, but what counts as important questions is so inherently bound in identity and positionality, which we'll go on to talk about next. And I really appreciate, Jay, you reminding us about the need for a kind of sensitivity or literacy almost around the kinds of questions that get asked, that we pause and again, we always talk about the importance of context in scholarship of teaching and learning, but we often think of that in itself in a very narrow way of the context of the discipline or the classroom or the kinds of institution we might be, or perhaps our geographical location. But in terms of context, thinking about identity and positionality is super important too. So so much already in our first section, and I want to pause and acknowledge I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat, but perhaps we're going to ask our panelists just to take a sip of coffee and water. I'll do the same and invite our audience to either pop a question into the chat, and we'll have 5 minutes to give you the opportunity to ask our panelists any questions that are coming up for you or reflections on the ideas that we've talked about so far. And we'll have 5 minutes to do that. Feel free to also unmute, introduce yourself and ask the question. I see we have Lorelei asking if equitable education is a wicked problem where the costs of getting it wrong fall hardest on the most vulnerable. How do we make sure SoTL inquiry doesn't reproduce that same inequity in who bears the risk of the research itself? Wonderful question. Who'd like to jump in or respond to Lorelei's question there?
I don't know if anyone else wants to go. I don't know if this is going to answer the question, because I feel like when this kind of question gets asked a lot, we expect some kind of here's a step-by-step guide. But I genuinely think one of the things I've noticed in education, in academia, in SoTL is like so much of what doesn't end up happening is just conversations happening between people. So I'll be talking with colleagues and we'll be talking about something that for me feels like, oh, this is a very obvious question to ask. This is a very obvious thing to be considering. And the person I'm talking to is like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And part of that is because of like the position I hold, what I consider valuable to ask about. So I think sometimes just genuinely having more open and very transparent conversations with each other about what's going on, what we're genuinely experiencing in classrooms, in teaching, those kinds of things, get those conversations going. So it's not always up to the most vulnerable person to be the only one thinking about this kind of stuff. Because the unfortunate thing about privilege is you aren't even aware of the things that you aren't thinking of. And that still places some of that burden on the more marginalized individuals who are going to bring those topics into conversation, which is why I kind of emphasize open and honest and kind of vulnerable conversations where if we're all comfortable talking about, what's not going right, what are some of the things going on that we're not so comfortable with, it kind of helps set the stage to be able to talk about those things a bit more easily. And I don't know if that answers the question about research itself, but
Well, if I can add to Jay's excellent answer to the question, I think, and I really appreciate the question, and I just want to connect that question to Noreen's point about questions that are reflective and change-making, and inquiry that's reflective and change-making, and Jay's point about queerness is opening up possibility, because I think the way I framed the beginning of like Boyer and then professionalization potentially creates this binary. There's like liberatory SoTL, and then there is professional SoTL, and these are different things. And I don't think they have to be different things. So I'll put an example in the chat of an article that I think is really interesting myself. It is a study, it's from the US context and from a particular moment in the US context. So it's from first-year seminar professors at a liberal arts college in the US, looking at, does a unit on Me Too and on sexual consent change students' perceptions of how consent works around sex? And this is for first-year traditional undergraduates at a liberal arts college. And so the question both is very expansive and not a traditional SoTL question. The methods, though, are pretty traditional SoTL methods. And interestingly, and maybe depressingly, the finding is, nope. Like one unit doesn't actually deeply, especially for male students, change perceptions of consent. And so I think, in a way, this is an example of a professional SoTL sort of article. that is asking deeply reflective and change-oriented questions. And then in some ways are expanding the possibility of what can we ask questions about in SoTL. So it's not, and no one else was saying this, but it's not professional or liberatory or something like this. I think sometimes we could be both. Or maybe there's a different direction too, so we don't have binaries.
If there's time, I can jump in. Otherwise, I
Yeah,
think
Noreen, please do.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just like looking at the question Lorelei posted, and I was just thinking that we talk so much these days about positionality, importance of um, of inward reflection about where you are coming from. I think when we talk about equitable education in any scenario, and we need to also be mindful of the system within which we are talking about. So this equitable education being a wicked problem or is a very good example where there is not one solution, and which would be a very naive way to approach solving this issue, because there are multiple things connected within it. And the first thing that we need to be mindful about is where we are located, and if we are located within a system and which we are trying to change. It's like driving on a road and trying to change not your car but the direction of the road. You can't do that, but you can do that in various different ways, philosophical ways, but you can't actually change the road. If you're in water, you can't change the direction of the water. You can only change the direction of your swimming in that water. So being mindful of where you are located, what your positionality is, and what you are promoting, how you are upholding the system as you're moving forward, or not upholding it or trying to transform it, is one of the tiny places where we can actually apply ourselves, rather than naively approaching it that we are transforming the system and we will transform it by asking one question, or by I don't know if it's making sense in my head. It was making sense that we have to be aware of where we are located. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to maybe draw what I see as a thread between those three comments, and I'll move us into our next section of questions. And Lorelei, thank you for this question, because it leads us so nicely into what we're about to discuss. But I was hearing there the interrelated things of being very introspective and aware of our own position and our motivations and what we bring into and our ways of knowing and being and doing into the kinds of questions we ask, and being able to be transparent, as much as that will feel okay in certain spaces or not. And then Peter, your caution about binary ways of thinking or dichotomous ways of thinking, if we fall into that trap, we risk not in the sense that Lorelei's asking around recentering, but perhaps further marginalizing or othering work around or the possibility for SoTL to not only be focusing on what is good learning in the classroom environment, but how is that good learning happening within the social context that is influenced around power and social location and positionality. So thanks for the question, Lorelei. Again, audience members, please keep putting comments, thoughts, questions in the chat. I'm going to move us on now to our second section, which is going to invite our panelists to talk about positionality, social location, and the uneven exposures to risk. So building really nicely on what the question that we've just had there. So if I could invite our panelists to share with us and we've touched on it already in the conversation we were just having there around the ways in which you think positionality influences what feels possible in solo work. And feel free to draw on whichever perspectives help us think through the topic of positionality and social location. And in particular, what do you think are the key things that we should be thinking about in the field when we hear this term positionality? What are the key things that we as scholars and practitioners should be thinking about? And Jay, perhaps I can invite you to open for us if you're comfortable to do so. And then Noreen and Peter, please feel free to build on the question.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to try not to ramble because I have many thoughts about this topic. But so as I was touching on earlier, I think one of the things with my area of work around like queerness and transness and gender is I tend to prefer more strength-based or like joy-based approaches as opposed to deficit. But I want to preface what I'm about to say is not necessarily meant to be like euphoric, like this utopian idea. But I do genuinely think that our positionality can influence what feels possible, and that again, the more when you hold marginalized positions, I think you are both viscerally aware of the system of power, of unequal structure that you exist in, but also because that system is never going to accept you, it does make certain things feel more possible or even more worth approaching. So for like with queerness, I know that I, as a queer, non-binary, trans person, I'm never going to be fully accepted within this very like cis-normative, heteronormative system. And so for me, I feel less beholden to uphold some of those gender norms, to uphold those things. And for me, gender feels like it has endless possibilities. And same when I'm talking to students about this, of I got into academia and teaching and learning because I had bad experiences in university. And so I wanted to do what I could to make my classroom feel more accessible and inclusive, to make students feel like they had more of a space or a space that they could just breathe for a second. And because I, from that, I feel less beholden to maintaining the original system. Certain things other people are like, well, I don't know if that is a really good thing to consider or pursue or try, or this might have this problem. It feels more possible to me because I'm like, well, I don't care about the system we have. In fact, I really don't like it. But at the same time, there is also that power component and that stability and precarity where it might feel more possible, but I'm also acknowledging that like I am a grad student. I am teaching, but as a sessional instructor. And so I know at any point in time, anything I do could backfire, and that could mean that I don't have a career in this. So there's kind of that tension between like limitless possibility and also, do I care about the future career if it stays in this system, but I also need to pay bills. So I think all of these are conversations that anyone with any kind of like marginalized position is very familiar with having with themselves. That I think isn't often, it's very internal, so we don't often talk about it. And it's one of those things to keep in mind where like that's a complex calculation that lots of people are doing, that if you're not used to having to do, it's just like, whoa, all of that is going on in your head all the time. And so even just that is its own kind of burden to carry, I guess, that I think just that understanding, that empathy, that care, that building communities that are there to support you, not the system, is a huge part of that. And I my brain is already going in other directions, so I'm going to end it there to see if Noreen and Peter have anything they want to add.
Yeah, Noreen and Peter, please jump in.
Yeah, I would add that I would actually, I totally hear you, Jay, when you are saying that positionality, it shapes not only what questions we are asking, but it also shapes, it also informs what it costs to ask them. So at what cost you are asking what questions, and the same sort of project or say can be read very differently depending on who's doing it. Um, so positionality also involves um, a finer judgment about competence and legitimacy at some points. Yeah.
I want to thank you, Noreen. I want to add two things to what you just said and connect back to Jay's comment. And the first one's sort of a downer, and then the second one is much happier. And that, from my perspective, besides yes to what Jay and Noreen have said, I think in SoTL, we may not always think enough about our students' positionality. And so, if I'm studying how do discussions work in my class, students are not just generic people in my class. There is identity and power and things like that that they hold, or more or less of, in different ways. And so being attentive to that, there's a beautiful paper I'll post later, because I didn't have it ready, about how identity shapes student discussions in biology courses. Really looking carefully at identities. So paying attention to student positionality, and also I think to stretch positionality a little bit, I think in SoTL we could be more attentive to disciplinary positionality. Because in higher education right now, some disciplines are widely, I think, well, the resources, the attention, the love and support goes in the United States until very, very recently, like STEM education was where it's at. There was huge amounts of money flowing to STEM education for good reasons. I'm not critical of that. But there's a lot of disciplines that there wasn't that kind of resources and there wasn't that kind of legitimacy. So if you publish in, I don't know, dance education, so there's that issue. But that's sort of I think it's important for us to notice different kinds of positionality in these spaces. But I want to go back to Jay's point about joy and about how maybe one of the real opportunities right now in SoTL is to draw on Jay's point about queerness and to say, let's look for possibilities that are just radically outside what is typically understood and say, what's possible if we do this? And so let me give you an example. Just from yesterday, I saw this. I have an amazing colleague. I have a lot of amazing colleagues, but he doesn't know I'm going to say this. I don't know him well. His name is Israel Balderas. He teaches media law at Elon. And he's teaching a media law course right now to undergraduates. And it's the end of the term, right? This is the traditional time where students grind out research papers on some aspect of media law. We all know, first of all, that wasn't great 10 years ago. And now with AI, who's actually grinding out these things? So Israel does this amazing thing. Students have to do all the work for this, but they don't write a paper. He creates a video with each student based on carpool karaoke, where he and the two students who did the research on this topic sit in his Jeep with him, and they're videoed, and they have to have brought a song that the three of them are going to sing. And Israel says he's not a good singer, but the point is not that he's a good singer. He's a joyous singer. They're going to sing, and then they're going to talk about how that song connects to core issues in media law related to this particular topic. So first of all, you can't AI that, right? Secondly, other students want to watch these videos, which is not always the case in research presentations, believe it or not, at least in the United States. And then thirdly, people send the videos to their parents and to their families. So they're teaching everybody about media law from research. So he, in my sense, he's less concerned about how AI is shaping this traditional research project because of the way students are demonstrating their research, which is joyful, which is human, which is a little silly. And so anyways, it strikes me as a wonderful example of saying, let's not have another conversation about AI detection in media law papers. Let's have a little inquiry into what happens if students have to sing with their professor in a silly but known genre about media law. Because my sense is they're gonna learn, they're gonna remember, and they're gonna smile. Right? That seems like a pretty awesome teaching.
I'm just reflecting on how badly I would do in that assessment if singing
I am
was
an awful singer.
it was the criteria
And
for marking. But
he makes a
one
point of saying
yeah,
he's a bad
yeah,
singer, right? So it's
yeah,
not like I'm
yeah,
going to do opera with you. It's like we're all going to suck, but it's going to be fun.
yeah, yeah. And I really appreciate the ways in which you're pulling out kind of the notions of limitless possibilities and um, how a reframing of dealing with something that is a very live common challenge across disciplines, sorry, in ways that can feel joyous, can feel exciting, and that there are these possibilities, even with the caveat and the kind of conversation that we're having around the cognitive and emotional labor around Jay, I think it was you that said, all of these things are going on in my mind at any one time around the decisions that I make, and being really aware of that for ourselves and for our colleagues, and tying it back to the comments that you were making in your first panel around the importance of of an ethic of care, acknowledging that cognitive and an emotional labor is happening for us when we're thinking about these limitless possibilities, but also asking questions and having teaching innovations that might push the envelope a little bit. And perhaps I can jump around a little bit with questions because I think this might lead on naturally for us, which is one of the things we talked about in preparing for today's panel was not only what does it feel like to be a person taking risks and in the context of our own social locations and identities and positionalities, but what is the responsibility of other people around us to support taking risks and so on. So I was just wondering to invite you all, like, what do you think are the responsibilities of more privileged or more securely located, and please take that up in whatever way you would like to, scholars in relation to risk taking in scholarship of teaching and learning? What are your views on that?
Am I supposed to start? I can, I
Yeah,
guess.
Peter, if you'd like to, yeah.
Just very, very briefly, I think those of us who hold privileged identities, I'm a full professor, I'm a straight white male, I'm in the United States. I think we need to take risks ourselves. I think we need to step forward. I think we need to hold up wonderful work by people who don't get as much attention and don't have as many privileges. And, use time, energy, privilege, whatever authority we have to be, using Jay's phrase, to be, creating more possibilities and showing that there's more ways to be doing valuable, meaningful, maybe even exceptional social work. And because the risks to me are quite low of doing any of that, unlike to, let's say, a new PhD candidate or a new PhD, less than 1 year, right, Shay? So I think we need to reflect, into Noreen's point, we need to be reflective about our own positionality and our own and the kinds of change we want to make in our work, and then we need to act on it. And I, not to be too whatever, but it can feel risky to do that too. If you're in a comfortable place, it's pretty nice being comfortable. So recognizing that this can, everybody can feel some degree of risk in this. But I go back to an article I read 10 years ago, which asked this question: are we liberating our colleagues and our students, or are we part of the machinery suppressing them? And I think we got to ask ourselves that question every day.
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty there, Peter, around the feeling of discomfort that it might be when in a privileged position, stepping in and challenging places or spaces or people that may not be open to the ways of inclusivity or giving platform or space or air to people that are traditionally marginalized. I think that requires a certain kind of disposition to be prepared to step into discomfort. It might not be necessarily risk, but it might feel uncomfortable. And I think that's a really nuanced difference there that's helpful.
Well, and also not positioning myself or others as some sort of savior in this work, right? It's like, I am going to help you.
Yeah.
So it's because sometimes it's easier to say, I'm just going to make space for others to speak. And it's important that we make space for others to speak, but sometimes we've got to speak into that space.
Speak into that space. Noreen and Jay, what other thoughts would you have that you'd like to share with people on this topic of what responsibilities do privileged and secure colleagues in the academy have to support risk-taking in SoTL?
Yeah, I'm there. Thank you, Peter, for offering that. And it is heartening to see that there is a conversation, there's a reflection going on, that how do we create a space for risk-taking in SoTL for those who might not see themselves in the position to take risks. I just keep wondering, what would that space look like? What would it be? Would it mean it's of course it's not coddling or or a savior mentality that I'm seeing there. I'm wondering if it is allyship, or if it is creating possibilities for newer or scholars, newer faculty interested in creating those ways, making, for example, co-publishing, for example, we are in academia, we are in the business of publications and peer reviews, looking for scholars who are at the margins and looking for their scholarship and including it in citations and references. So what is it? What does this space looks like? That's my wondering. Rather than offering what this space is, I would like to understand with the group, what does it look like, including students in this, students as partners in this work I find is creating a space for that. So I'm just offering a number of questions rather than an answer to it. Yeah.
And just to add on to this, one of the things that I know we've talked about in previous sessions and also when we were planning this one is that, like, in addition to the actual work that is being published in terms of like thinking about that as risky work, I know that also just existing in academia can be risky for different people. I think of so many different trans scholars I know in the US who, like, just being visible in academia as a trans person is risky. You face a lot of backlash and a lot of stressors from students, from faculty, from people who aren't even involved in academia. And that's just one identity. So one of the things that I think oftentimes people overlook the importance of is how much of that environment is built just in day-to-day interactions. So again, going back to sociology, we're in those like symbolic interactionist kind of perspectives. And I think so much of that could be addressed by genuinely getting to know the people in your department who you work with all the time, knowing what they do. That way, when you're in all those little conversations where someone says something, offhand, or we're talking about a different thing, you can kind of both stand up for someone. So if they aren't getting support about something, but also highlight their work. So say like, oh yeah, it's really interesting that we talk about this. Like I was just talking to my friend Alex about using tabletop role play games for teaching. And there's some really interesting things that they're doing there. And also just genuinely really highlight the important work that's being done of like, oh yeah, I love what they're doing in the classroom. Even if it's not, published work, you can still give a lot of support in that way. And the same applies for students, both the amount of times that I have heard a student talking about another grad student who's like teaching a course in the spring. And I was like, oh, you would love to take a course with this person. They have a similar approach to how you like to learn, or vice versa. I'll hear about a research project going on or something. I'm like, oh, I actually know a student who just took research methods with me. They were really interested in this kind of methodology. So those kind of like interaction to interaction kind of things that can only really be facilitated by getting to know each other, which is terrifying as an introverted person. But I think it's really important for those small scale changes.
Yeah, and I think Noreen, you use the wanderings of, is it allyship? Is it and thinking about Lorelei's question of how can we make sure we don't recenter inequities. Jay, the example that you're describing there is kind of a call to action, really, to lift up, to spotlight, to and the time that takes, the investment to know also is an actionable thing. I wonder if that's what it might look like in response to Noreen's challenge to us of, in those small interactions, we spend time in a very conscious way of mentioning, of sharing, but that requires a commitment to a certain professional practice, which is finding out, asking too. So, which makes me think about the pressures of us on time and the uneven asks around time and commitments in the system and the academy. Um, Perhaps I could pause us there on this particular section and turn to questions. I see that Kimberly has asked, we talk about making teaching and learning visible, and she quotes John Hattie's work, Harvard's Project Zero, etc. A comment from Jay now has me pondering, what if SoTL is a way to make visible the teaching and learning conversations we already have with ourselves? Lovely question there. What does that make you think of, panelists? What a vision of SoTL that makes our teaching and learning conversations that we have with ourselves more visible.
Kimberly, I love the question, and I think there is some degree of something like autoethnography in SoTL already, but maybe there's space for a lot more. And then I was talking with a colleague this morning who admitted, and she was very embarrassed by this, but I don't think she should. She's got a 45-minute drive to and from campus. She talks to Claude about how her classes are going on her way home and asks for suggestions and guidance and things like that. She doesn't do necessarily what Claude says, but there is this whole other aspect of who are we having conversations with about teaching and learning? And anyways, so I was struck in your comment too by, I've always assumed when we're talking about conversations, we're talking to humans, but we might be talking to our dogs, or we might be talking to an AI bot at this point. And how does that matter? And does that matter? So I think there's interesting space for that. I'm going to send a note to my colleague saying she should write an article about her conversations with Claude.
Jay or Noreen, is there anything you'd like to add?
Things. One, following up on Peter's comment, I do think there is a conversation to be had about like genuinely who we're having conversations with. But I I would push back of like I think it's interesting how much we see people turning to like AI chatbots or computers or things like that in a time where we also have a loneliness problem where people feel disconnected. And I understand that like there is this element of the time it takes to build community. Like community is a thing you have to build. But I also think that there's so much benefit to it. And for a lot of marginalized communities, like it's not something you have to think about, it's something you have to do because it's the only way to survive. And so those in those precarious positions are already having to put in that time to build community. So I always like to encourage people that like genuinely we shouldn't forsake or dismiss like the importance of human connection in a lot of regards for this. But also in terms of Kimberly's question, one of the things that I really deal with a lot is emotions. And so like the emotional aspect of teaching, the emotional aspect of learning. We talked about in the first session, like dealing with discomfort and things like that. And one of the things I really wish that SoTL publications engaged more with in a genuine, like valued way is the emotional aspect, the emotional experience, what we can learn from those emotional experiences, because too often in academia, we kind of discount emotions. You know, the positivist framework comes through strong in some areas when emotions teach us a lot. Emotions influence a lot of what we're doing. And so that is one area that I really hope that SoTL as a field can engage with in an authentic way more.
It's
Um,
Noreen. Yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, this is such a wonderful way of, and a generative way of thinking about some of the questions we might be too shy to ask. Like, for example, how do you make teaching and learning visible, and how do we talk about making it visible? So it is within itself. It is a risky question. There is a vulnerability associated with it, talking to yourself, talking to your dog, talking to AI chatbot. Like there is a safety net there, and what you can share there. But when you talk about making it visible and sharing with other people, humans, individuals, then where you are speaking from, who is speaking, and who's sharing, actually adds to a lot of autoethnographic knowledge that you might be generating from this kind of a conversation. So I take it as a risky question, as a risky social question, and as a which puts us on a vulnerable place. And the lens that we bring with us, for example, the intersectionality lens or the post-colonial lens, for example. So I'm thinking here with Kimberly Cranshaw's work on intersectionality, which reminds us that people do not experience institutions through one identity or social location at a time. Race, gender, class, language, migration status, histories, disabilities, indigeneity, and all these things, they intersect to shape what might feel possible to reveal and make visible, and what it may cost to reveal that or make it visible. So I'm just going to stop there. Yeah,
May
wonderful
I
question.
may I add one thing that
Yeah.
Jay and Noreen's comments got me thinking about that I haven't thought about in a long time. But if you go back to some of the early SoTL writing and thinking, there were a lot of questions about what are appropriate SoTL genres. Like, why are we? The question at the time was why scholarly articles as the way to demonstrate or to share SoTL work, because so much of it is conversational, so much of it is evolving and dialogic and things like this. And so I do wonder if there's deep questions that, back to Jay's really helpful frame about possibilities and thinking about in new ways. And I know some journals are playing with genres and things like this a bit more than they used to. Yet maybe they're relatively safe playing. And, are there ways that we can make visible the actually dialogical ways that a lot of how our inquiries play out? And I don't know that I'm certainly not saying like people should, I don't know, read a transcript of a conversation that a colleague and I have as we go for a walk and talk about something. I don't know that that's interesting to anybody else. Yet the article that comes out of that walk is only a certain slice of what happens there. So I'm curious if there's different media or different, maybe we could do karaoke versions of SoTL articles. I have no idea what. But
Carpool
maybe there's
karaoke.
ways, yeah. Maybe there's different ways of making
Yeah.
public some of our work and making visible some of our work that don't end up cramming it into conventional scholarly genres.
Yeah. I think the conversation raises so many interesting questions around how do we go public, like it challenges like what does going public mean? And there's been um lots of really interesting things written about that. But methodologically, how are we thinking about evidencing our work? What is the location of conversation that we want to make visible in our work? And it's making me think about Schulman's challenge to us about making teaching community property. Part of, Kimberly, your question makes me think about in what ways are we making visible not just what's happening in our teaching practice, but all of those emotional and affective components that Jay is talking about there. And I see that Peter's already mentioned the work of Roxa and Mortensen, but I'm also thinking about their work around significant conversations and significant networks, and how within those significant networks, one of the characteristics is kind of vulnerable conversations and high levels of trust. So, what are the ingredients that make it possible and safe and less risky, perhaps less risky rather than safe for us to have these kinds of conversations? And then one other final reflection from me is we're here to talk about scholarship of teaching and learning, but there's parallel scholarship in the scholarship of educational development. And within that professional field, I think some of those conversations, for those of us that are located in those parts of the university, are inherently about making visible some of these kind of issues and ideas. And so Kimberly's question also makes me think about where else is this being addressed and being published on? Um, in the interest of the time, I'm going to perhaps move us on to our third and final section, and perhaps use Peter's last comment around how do we make these things visible? What things are um, in what ways when we're sharing our scholarship, in what ways does the academy value that? And I'd like to shift us into the final section talking about kind of risk and change making and institutional systems. And for those of you that joined us for the second session, there were quite a lot of comments from our panelists in that session talking about the interplay between risk and different parts of the ecosystem of a university. So perhaps I could ask a question here of our panelists. What are examples of risks that have led to meaningful change? That might be at individual, departmental, institutional levels. And from your experiences, what made those meaningful changes possible? So again, thinking through a kind of systems level way of thinking about these things. And Jay, I was wondering if I could come to you to start us off in response to that question.
Yeah, so I don't know if I can necessarily speak to like departmental or institutional level change. But one example that comes to mind that we ended up talking about when we were meeting to plan this, was so I taught Intro to Sociology in the fall, and at U Calgary, that is at that point in time, 400-person course, and it was my first time teaching a course by myself, right? And I have a fiery hatred for multiple choice exams. I hate them so much. Pedagogically, it doesn't do much for me. But in a course that big, there isn't really much other option for assessment. And I've always been a big proponent of a level of transparency and like engaging with students in a more conversational way, which can definitely backfire, especially if you're newer in the field of teaching. Sometimes students can kind of take that as an excuse to walk all over you. But for me, it's always more important for me to genuinely engage with my students. And so for this course, I ended up having a very honest conversation with the students at the beginning where I'm like, look, so here's how I approach teaching. I really hate multiple choice exams, but there are 400 of you and one of me. And so in terms of assessments, practically speaking, I don't really have much other option but to do exams. So with that in mind, here's how I write my exam questions to try to get at this deeper level of thinking. Here's how you can study for this kind of question. Here's how you can prepare. Here's why I'm asking this type of question, because to a student, it might just seem like a lot of reading and then a little short question at the end. And it ended up really changing the tone of that class, where again, there's 400 of them and one of me. But I ended up having a lot more students coming to like office hours to talk and be really honest of like, I don't know what I'm doing. I've never had to study for this kind of thing before. I'm really confused about how I get to that level of thinking. And also just conversations about, what their life is like and how to manage this kind of stuff. And so that level of honesty, of transparency, of vulnerability with students is really scary. It's because you can end up having students who take advantage of that, or it can get you into sticky positions. But I think the potential for that, for what the classroom can be in that space, if the professor who to the students is coming from a position of authority is willing to be that open, I think can really change a lot of at an individual level of how the students feel in that classroom, of how they approach that classroom as a learning space, and also how I'm able to connect with them as the instructor. So that's more of an individual level. And again, not always possible for everyone. I do have quite a bit of protection in terms of like, I might be trans, but I am very white. So there is that to think about. But I think vulnerability is scary, but it's something that we have to do as people.
Thanks, Jane. It's a nice example of kind of in individual practice thinking about the system limitations or the limitations that systems put on us, like dealing the way I might want to, my intention here with my teaching practice is X, but because of system level constraints, I have to do Y, and being really transparent about that. I think it's a really nice example about how those things happen. Noreen and Peter, anything you would like to add, build on?
Yeah, I would just add that Jane, this is such a brilliant example, but I would add to it that meaningful risk, it usually becomes possible because the risk is shared. So it is really that one person. It is really about one person being courageous. Like, for example, in this example, what I'm reading is that it often requires other colleagues or students in your ecosystem, and your departmental culture, leadership, creating that kind of a space, or institutional structures that allow difficult experimentations, opportunities for those experimentations. So which requires, of course, thinking, envisioning, and being courageous enough to try it out. But also it requires a buy-in from from your students, like 400 students, getting them shifted from a certain way of doing assessment into a different way. So that requires a buy-in, and to get them on the board to be as courageous and playful in this learning experiment. So it is that it becomes I think the shared understanding about the risk, developing that shared understanding is an important aspect here. One example that I can think about from my perspective, my work, or my SoTL work or my research work is participatory, using participatory methods and SoTL with students. So when students are invited into an inquiry, they're not only there to give feedback or answer our pre-developed questions, but they also create those questions, and they together with us, and they also help us interpret learnings from those experiences. And there is a risk in it. There's a huge risk in it, because they may name tensions. They may name tensions, for example, in the work that I do in context of group work or critique, about assessment, about belonging, or about classroom culture that we did not anticipate, and they might bring that up. But that risk can lead to meaningful transformation or change in our pedagogy, in my curricula that I design. And so it allows us to redistribute the interpretive authority of the work that we are doing in research. So it moves students from being just mere respondents to contributors, and to how we understand teaching and learning. So what makes that possible is not just the method, but it also requires developing the trust, the relationality, the ethical framing, institutional support in that, and a willingness from educators to be changed by what students say, rather than being challenged by it in negative ways. Yeah.
I love that example. Noreen and Jay, also, I should really take your class, I think. I have a lot of sociology to learn. I'm going to share just one example from a different level. So thinking about institutional change and institutional risk. And the quick version of this is based on something that is its 20th anniversary this year. But my own university, Elon, has a SoTL writing residency, a 4-day writing retreat for faculty, to support folks, especially folks who are new to writing in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And when that was created 20 years ago, the challenge was, it was really about risk. And there were two kinds of risk that faculty were facing. One was, there were a number of faculty who said, I know the institution's documents say SoTL is valued here, but show me a full professor who does SoTL. Show me someone who's been promoted and all this, right? And then secondly, there was a kind of risk of saying, a lot of faculty saying, I know how to write in my discipline. I don't know how to write like this. So the writing residency was meant to address those two things. And over the years, we've had to fight off the idea that this is a generic writing residency. It's not. It's about scholarship of teaching and learning. And so in any given year, there's maybe 12 to 15 faculty participants. So it's not huge. We have about 500 faculty now, full-time faculty. But over the last 20 years, back of the envelope, there's real numbers, but there's been something like 160, 175 SoTL articles published out of this residency. Now, some of them may have existed without the residency. But what this means now is you can look around campus, and it's not true that all the full professors have done SoTL. But you can point at a whole bunch of full professors who've done SoTL, some who their primary research stream is SoTL. You can point to people on the promotion and tenure committee who are published in this way. And so it has shifted the risk calculation. So now the risk is more, I don't know how to write in my in SoTL. That risk remains for a lot of participants, but the risk of will this be valued has mostly gone away. And I would say one of the things I hope folks notice about this is sometimes it takes time. Like 1 year of doing this did not change institutional culture. But 10 years of doing it, and there were a whole bunch of associate professors who had been promoted. In 20 years, there's department chairs and endowed professors who've participated. So thinking about time is one of the factors as we think about risk and as we think about change with SoTL. Just like we can't expect our students to learn huge things in one semester, we can't expect it to change our institutions or our disciplines, like that.
I'm going to pause us there with the panelists, if that's okay, and just move us to questions a question from our audience as we're approaching the end of our time together. I feel like we could do our own residency talking about some of these topics that have come up in this series. But a question from Holly. Thinking about what Noreen was talking about, risk, I wonder if any of you discuss that you are taking risks when you meet your students and explain that you need them to also take the risk. Wonderful question there from Holly. And a kind of a lovely question for us to bring our conversation to the end of this session today. So do you talk about risk explicitly with your students? Do you frame it in that way?
So can I just briefly respond to this? I love the question.
Yeah.
I don't frame it as risk. I say I'm really curious. I mean, I'm going back to what Jay said about joy. I try to make it a joyful thing, an interesting thing. I've never used the word joy with them. But I'm like, I'm really curious about what you're learning and how you're learning it. And I've been teaching a long time and I still don't understand it. That's why I do this sort of thing. That's why I hope you will partner with me in doing this work, because it's interesting, because it's fascinating. And, so risk comes up, but I don't lead with risk. I lead with curiosity and I lead with sort of passion, but perhaps that's because I'm a full professor who's a white guy who teaches history. So.
Been with I also don't know if I necessarily phrase it as risk, but so again, in sociology, and especially with my research focus that I draw on a lot when I'm teaching as examples, is I always have a conversation, it's in the syllabus, but also in the course, like very beginning of the course and throughout it of, we're gonna in this classroom, we might end up talking about things that are going to make some people feel uncomfortable, or you might feel discomfort as you're learning new things. I feel discomfort if I'm asking for feedback from you guys on how the course is going and you say something isn't going well. And here's how we navigate those feelings of discomfort, because that's where we learn things. And part of that discomfort means that we have to be open with each other. We have to talk to each other as people. We have to create this classroom as a space that we can share those things and be vulnerable. So I do talk about it in terms of vulnerability and discomfort, but that is one of the ways that we build connection with people as people, and that is going to look differently for different people, and it's going to be easier for some people than it is for others. So I don't know if I use the word risk always, but I am usually also pretty transparent about the fact that I'm this, in me being this level of honest and having this conversation with you, that is a little bit of riskiness in terms of teaching of, you guys don't have to engage with this, and then, I might be the only one saying things here, but comma, and here's why we do it.
Yeah, it's interesting that what I'm hearing in both Peter and Jay, your comments, that we do experiment, we do we do take risks in our teaching, but yet we don't call it risk. Similarly, in my own work as well, in my own teaching, I talk about this, for example, in an introduction of the course. I would say there will be moments of discomfort and vulnerability, and we might not be doing the things especially when I'm working with first year students who are being initiated into the discipline of information design and into the field of information design, and we start with learning the design thinking methods and processes. I talk about this as this will make you vulnerable. A lot of unlearning would be involved here. So you might see things, or you might learn things which you have learned otherwise earlier on. So that's the level. I also admit them to be adventurous, but yet I have to do it mindfully, because I don't want to mislead them, because we are existing within the structure where I would be grading them, evaluating their assignments, and I don't want to mislead them that this won't happen and you will not end up with a grade. And I don't overpromise them that I will give everybody an A plus grade because everybody is adventurous. So adventures with emotional intelligence and mindfulness, that this is within the realm of 13 or 14 weeks of the course that we are doing, and this is where we want to end with. But when we are doing experiential learning, I can't predict, and I don't want to predict for them what their experience might be, right? So I leave that room open for that the experience would be generative, and it would mean something different for each one of them, and it is a different experience for me every time. Even if I teach that course 3 times, I have taught that course in a row for 3 years or 4 years or something like that. So I promise adventure, but then I don't promise that the adventure will get you to an A plus grade. So that's where that's the risk with the pinch of salt there.
And I think that's a wonderful place for us to draw our conversation to a close today, thinking about we've heard words of joy, limitless possibilities, curiosity, being adventurous, whilst understanding that that it might feel risky and uncomfortable to enter those kinds of spaces. So I'd like to draw us to a close and leave our audience members pondering all of the rich conversation given to us today from Jay and Noreen and Peter. I'd like to extend deep appreciation for you taking the time in preparing this session and your generosity of your ideas that you've shared with us today. This conversation, a recording of it, will be made available and published on the web, on the Mocha Geeks website. I very nearly said the interweb, on the Mocha Geeks website and the Taylor Institute website, for you to be able to return to some of these ideas and also listen to session 1 and session 2. And with that, I'd like to draw us to a close and wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day and a joyous, limitless summer of possibilities. Thank you, everyone.